Imagine a world without refrigerators, without plastic bottles, without carbonation, without sugar-laden cans lined up on supermarket shelves. Imagine waking up on a morning 2,000 years ago, your throat dry, your body aching from sleeping on a stone surface covered with straw, and the only thing between you and dehydration is whatever your community managed to collect, press, ferment, or draw from the earth the day before. What would you drink? What would touch your lips first thing in the morning in a land where the sun could crack the ground open, and where every drop of liquid carried meaning far beyond simple refreshment? Have you ever stopped to wonder what filled the cups at the tables where some of the most important conversations in human history took place? Have you ever considered that the beverages of that era were not just sustenance, but markers of social class, religious identity, and even political allegiance? And what if the answer to what people drank in the year 30 AD reveals more about the ancient world than any temple ruin or scroll fragment ever could? This is not a story about a single person. This is a journey through liquid, through what was poured, what was shared, what was forbidden, and what was sacred. By the end of this documentary, you will understand something that most people never think about, that every civilization is quietly defined not just by what it builds, but by what it drinks. And the world of 30 AD, the world of the Eastern Mediterranean, of dusty Roman provinces, of Jewish tradition and Greco-Roman influence, had a relationship with beverages so layered, so deeply tied to survival and meaning, that once you see it, you will never look at a simple glass of water the same way again. Let us begin where everything begins. Let us begin with thirst. You are standing in the region of Galilee. The year is roughly 30 of the Common Era. The air around you is warm even in the early hours. The terrain rolls gently, rocky hillsides dotted with olive trees, small vineyards clinging to the slopes, and in the distance, a lake so calm it mirrors the pale morning sky. The villages are small, clusters of flat-roofed stone houses, narrow pathways between them, the smell of baking bread already drifting from the communal ovens. There is no plumbing. There are no taps. The concept of running water inside a home belongs to the wealthy elite of Rome, not to the working families of this rural province. Here, water is something you walk to get. It is something you carry. It is something you guard. The primary sources of drinking water in this region are wells, springs, and cisterns. Wells are dug deep into the limestone bedrock, sometimes reaching 30 or 40 feet before hitting the water table. Springs emerge naturally, where underground aquifers meet the surface, and they are considered precious, so precious that entire villages are built around them. Cisterns, on the other hand, are man-made reservoirs carved into rock or built from plastered stone, designed to catch and store rainwater during the brief but intense rainy season that runs from roughly November to March. The rest of the year, when rain is scarce or non-existent, these cisterns become lifelines. You approach a village well in the early morning. There is already a small gathering, women mostly carrying clay jars balanced on their heads or gripped against their hips. The well is communal. It belongs to no single family but to the village as a whole, and its maintenance is a shared responsibility. The rope is rough, woven from plant fibers, and the bucket is heavy, made of leather or thick pottery. Drawing water is physical labor. The rope burns against your palms. The bucket comes up slowly, dripping, the water inside cool from the depth of the earth. You pour it into your jar, and even this simple act, the transfer of water from well to vessel, carries a rhythm that has been repeated here for centuries. But here is what most people do not realize about water in this era. It was not always safe. The ancients understood through hard experience that some water sources could make you ill. Stagnant water, water from certain cisterns that had not been properly maintained, water that had been contaminated by animal waste or decay, these were recognized hazards. The solution was not filtration as we understand it. There were no chemical treatments, no purification tablets. Instead, people relied on a combination of practices, letting water settle so that sediment would sink to the bottom, straining it through cloth, or, most commonly, mixing it with something else. And this is where the story begins to deepen. because the most universal additive to water in the ancient Mediterranean world was not lemon, not sugar, not ice. It was wine. Wine was not a luxury in 30 AD. It was a staple. To understand the beverage culture of this period, you must completely abandon the modern Western association of wine with fine dining, celebration, or indulgence. In the 1st century Eastern Mediterranean, wine was closer to what water is for us today, a daily necessity consumed by nearly everyone, from the wealthiest Roman senator to the poorest Galilean fisherman. The difference lay not in whether you drank wine, but in what kind of wine you drank, how much you diluted it, and what it said about your place in the world. The winemaking process in this region was ancient, even by the standards of 30 AD. Grapes had been cultivated in the Levant for thousands of years. The hillsides of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee were covered with vineyards, their terraced rows carved into the rocky slopes to maximize sun exposure and drainage. The harvest came in late summer when the grapes had swollen to their peak sweetness. Entire families participated. The grapes were gathered by hand, carried in baskets to the wine press, a shallow basin carved directly into the rock, usually on a hillside so that gravity could assist the flow. You stand at the edge of one of these presses. The basin is about 6 feet across, its stone surface stained dark from years of use. The grapes are piled inside, glistening in the afternoon sun, their skins taut and purple-black. Workers step into the basin barefoot and begin to tread. The sound is wet and rhythmic, a soft crushing, a steady pulse. The juice runs downward through a small channel carved into the stone, collecting in a lower basin where it will begin its transformation. The air is thick with the scent of grape sugar, almost syrupy, and the flies are already gathering. This is not an elegant process. It is agricultural, physical, and deeply communal. Once the juice was collected, it was transferred to large clay jars or stone vats for fermentation. The process was natural. Wild yeasts present on the grape skins initiated the conversion of sugar into alcohol. There were no temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks, no carefully selected yeast cultures. The winemaker's skill lay in knowing when to seal the vessel, how long to let the fermentation proceed, and how to store the finished product to prevent it from turning to vinegar, a constant risk in the warm climate. The resulting wine was typically strong, thick, and deeply colored, far more concentrated than most wines consumed today. This is a crucial point. Ancient wine was rarely, if ever, consumed undiluted. The standard practice, inherited from Greek tradition and reinforced by Roman custom, was to mix wine with water before drinking. The typical ratio ranged from 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, though this varied by occasion, personal preference, and social context. Drinking wine without water, what the Greeks called akratos, was considered barbaric, a sign of excess and moral weakness. The Romans largely agreed. Even in Jewish tradition, while the rules were less formalized, the mixing of wine with water was common practice. This mixture served multiple purposes. It made the wine more palatable and less intoxicating, obviously. But it also made the water safer. The alcohol content of the wine, even diluted, provided a mild antiseptic effect that could reduce the risk of waterborne illness. The acidity of the wine further inhibited the growth of harmful organisms. In a world without germ theory, without microscopes, without any understanding of bacteria, people had stumbled upon a practical solution through generations of trial and observation. The wine-water mixture was, in effect, the ancient world's most reliable everyday beverage, safer than plain water, more nourishing than either component alone, and available to nearly every household that could tend even a small vineyard or barter for wine at the local market. Now consider the social dimensions. Wine in 30 AD was not a single product. It existed along a vast spectrum of quality, and your position on that spectrum said everything about who you were. At the top, there were prized vintages from regions known for excellence, wines from the coast, from specific valleys, from estates whose reputation stretched across the Roman Empire. These wines were aged, carefully stored in sealed amphorae, and traded across vast distances by sea and overland caravan. They appeared at the banquets of governors, at the feasts of the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem, at the lavish dinner parties of Roman elites who reclined on cushioned couches and sipped from silver cups while slaves attended their every need. At the bottom of the spectrum was Posca. And Posca is one of the most fascinating beverages of the ancient world, precisely because it was so common and so overlooked. Posca was, in essence, vinegar mixed with water. When wine went bad, when it soured, when it turned acidic beyond the point of pleasant drinking, it did not become worthless. It became Posca, and Posca was the drink of the Roman army, the drink of laborers, the drink of the poor. Roman soldiers carried it in their canteens as they marched across provinces, and its sharp, tangy flavor masked the taste of questionable water sources encountered on the road. The vinegar base provided the same antiseptic benefits as wine, perhaps even more effectively, while being far cheaper to produce and transport. Posca is important to this narrative because it appears at one of the most described moments in Western history. During the final hours of a well-known trial and public punishment in Jerusalem around the year 30, a sponge soaked in this sour liquid was raised on a stick. For centuries, many interpreted this act as one of cruelty, offering vinegar to a suffering man. But understood in context, Posca was simply what the soldiers had on hand. It was their standard issue beverage. The gesture may have been one of indifferent routine, or even a small act of pragmatic mercy, offering the only liquid available. This single detail, so easily misunderstood, illustrates why knowing what people actually drank changes the way we interpret historical events. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. Every detail in this documentary has been carefully researched to reveal the hidden layers of the ancient world that most people never see. And this is just the beginning. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next, because the deeper we go, the more surprising this journey becomes. Let us move now from the vineyards and the soldiers' canteen to something more intimate, the household. Step inside a first-century home in a village like Nazareth or Capernaum. The door is low, made of rough wood. You duck slightly to enter. The interior is dim, the walls thick stone that keeps the worst of the heat at bay. The floor is packed earth or rough flagstone. There is a single room, perhaps two, where the entire family lives, sleeps, cooks, and eats. In one corner, clay storage jars, large, wide-mouthed vessels sealed with cloth and rope, line the wall. Some contain grain. Some contain olive oil. And some contain the household's supply of wine. But wine was not the only beverage stored here. In the agricultural world of first-century Palestine, milk played a role that we need to understand carefully, because it was not consumed the way modern people consume milk. Fresh milk spoiled rapidly in the warm climate. Without refrigeration, a jar of goat's milk drawn in the morning could begin to sour by midday. Cow's milk was less common in this region. Cattle required more water and pasture than the semi-arid landscape could easily support. Goats and sheep were the primary dairy animals, and their milk was a valuable resource, but it was almost always transformed before consumption. The most common dairy beverage was what we might call Laban or Laban, a fermented milk product similar to modern yogurt drinks like ayran or kefir. The fermentation process was simple and likely discovered by accident thousands of years before this period. Milk stored in animal skin bags, exposed to natural bacteria in the warm air, would curdle and thicken, developing a tangy, slightly sour flavor. This fermented milk lasted longer than fresh milk, was easier to digest, and provided a concentrated source of nutrition. It was consumed directly as a drink, poured over bread or mixed with water to create a thin, refreshing beverage that was particularly valued during the hot summer months. The process of making this fermented milk was part of the daily rhythm of the household. You watch as a woman pours fresh goat's milk into a leather bag, adds a small amount of the previous day's fermented milk as a starter culture, though she would not have used that term, and hangs the bag in a warm corner of the house. By the next morning, the milk has thickened, its surface slightly bubbly, its smell sharp and clean. She pours it into a clay bowl, and the family drinks it with their morning bread. This is not a recipe. This is survival technology, refined over millennia, passed from mother to daughter without written instruction. Butter was also produced from this milk, churned in skin bags by rocking or shaking them vigorously. The butter that resulted was not the solid yellow blocks we know today. It was soft, white, and slightly tangy. closer to what we would call clarified butter or ghee when it was heated and preserved. While butter itself was not a beverage, the buttermilk left behind after churning was. This thin, slightly acidic liquid was consumed as a drink and valued for its cooling properties. In a world where the midday temperature could exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit and where physical labor under the sun was the norm for most people, a cup of cool buttermilk was not a minor comfort. It was a lifeline. Now let us talk about something that surprises many modern viewers. Honey-based beverages. The land described in ancient texts as flowing with milk and honey was not using poetic language accidentally. Honey was one of the most important natural sweeteners available, and it was also used to make drinks. The simplest form was honey water, a mixture of honey dissolved in water, sometimes with herbs added for flavor. This was consumed as a refreshing drink and also used medicinally. Ancient medical practitioners prescribed honey water for sore throats, digestive problems, and general weakness. But honey could also be fermented. The resulting beverage, known across many cultures by different names, most commonly mead, was one of the oldest alcoholic drinks in human history, predating wine by thousands of years. Whether mead was widely consumed in first-century Palestine specifically is a matter of some debate among historians, but the practice of fermenting honey was certainly known in the broader ancient world. In regions where grapes did not grow well, mead served as the primary alcoholic beverage. In the Mediterranean, where wine dominated, honey-based drinks occupied a more specialized niche, valued for their sweetness, their medicinal associations, and their use in certain religious or ceremonial contexts. The production of honey itself was a significant enterprise. Beekeeping in the ancient Levant used clay hives, cylindrical tubes stacked horizontally in rows, often built into walls or placed on rooftops. Archaeological excavations have uncovered apiaries containing dozens or even hundreds of these hives, indicating organized, large-scale honey production. The honey harvested was thick, golden, intensely fragrant, and, without the processing and filtering of modern commercial honey, full of bits of wax, pollen, and propolis that gave it a complex, almost floral bitterness beneath the sweetness. When dissolved in water, this honey created a drink that was simultaneously sweet, slightly bitter, and deeply aromatic. Nothing like the bland sugar water that modern honey-flavored drinks often produce. This is a good moment to pause and ask you something. As you listen to these descriptions, as you imagine the taste of fermented goat's milk on a hot afternoon or the sharp sweetness of honey dissolved in well water, what strikes you the most? What detail has surprised you? Write it in the comments below. Leave a comment saying which ancient beverage you would most want to taste if you could travel back to the year 30 AD. Because the answers people give to this question reveal something fascinating about how we project our modern tastes onto the ancient world, and I want to hear yours. Let us continue deeper. We have covered water, wine, pasca, fermented milk, and honey beverages. But there is another category of drink that permeated daily life in the first century, and it is one that modern people rarely consider because it has no exact equivalent in our current drinking habits. We are talking about fruit-based beverages, and specifically about pomegranate. The pomegranate was one of the most symbolically charged fruits in the ancient Near East. It appeared in religious texts, in temple decorations, on priestly garments, and in everyday art and craft. But beyond its symbolic weight, the pomegranate was a practical source of juice. The fruit grew abundantly in the region, its leathery red skin protecting hundreds of jewel-like seeds, each encased in a sac of tart, sweet liquid. Extracting this juice was labor-intensive. The seeds had to be separated from the bitter white pith, then crushed or pressed. The resulting juice was vivid, deep red, intensely flavored, and slightly astringent. Pomegranate juice was consumed fresh, but it could also be reduced by slow cooking into a thick syrup, a concentrated sweetener and flavoring agent that could be stored for months. This syrup, diluted with water, created a refreshing drink that was prized for its flavor and its perceived health benefits. Ancient medical texts attributed a wide range of properties to pomegranate. It was thought to aid digestion, strengthen the body, and even ward off certain illnesses. Modern science, interestingly, has confirmed that pomegranates are indeed rich in antioxidants and beneficial compounds, suggesting that the ancients' intuitive appreciation for this fruit was well-founded. But pomegranate was not the only fruit used for beverages. Date juice, extracted from the abundant date palms that grew in the Jordan Valley and other low-lying areas, was another significant drink. Dates were one of the most calorie-dense foods available in the ancient world, and their juice, when extracted by soaking or pressing, produced a thick, syrupy liquid that was almost overwhelmingly sweet. This date honey, as it was sometimes called, was used much like bee honey, as a sweetener, a preservative, and a base for drinks. When diluted with water, it produced a beverage that was nourishing, energy-rich, and satisfying in a way that plain water could never be. Figs, too, contributed to the beverage landscape. Dried figs soaked in water produced a mildly sweet, slightly musky liquid that was consumed as a simple drink or used as a base for more complex preparations. Fig-based beverages were particularly common among the poor, for whom dried figs were an affordable and widely available food. The water left over from soaking figs, fig water, was not discarded but consumed deliberately, a practice that illustrates the ancient world's deep aversion to waste. In a subsistence economy, every calorie and every drop of flavor mattered. Now, here is where things get interesting from a cultural perspective. All of these beverages, wine, fermented milk, honey water, fruit juices, existed within a framework of religious law and social custom that governed who could drink what, when, and how. For the Jewish population of first-century Palestine, the laws of kashrut, dietary regulations derived from Scripture, imposed certain restrictions and requirements on food and drink. Wine, for example, had to be produced by Jewish hands to be considered kosher. Wine produced by non-Jews, or wine that had been used in pagan religious ceremonies, was strictly forbidden. This was not merely a matter of taste or preference. It was a boundary marker, a line that separated the Jewish community from the surrounding Greco-Roman culture and its religious practices. This distinction had profound practical implications. In a region where Jews, Greeks, Romans, Syrians, and other groups lived in close proximity, the question of whose wine you could drink was really a question of whose table you could share, whose hospitality you could accept, whose world you could enter. Refusing someone's wine was not a dietary quirk. It was a statement of identity, a declaration of belonging, and sometimes an act of resistance against the cultural pressure of the Roman Empire. If this detail alone does not make you appreciate how much meaning was packed into something as simple as a cup of wine 2,000 years ago, then consider this. The ritual use of wine in Jewish practice was not optional. It was commanded. The Sabbath meal, the Passover Seder, circumcision ceremonies, wedding feasts, all of these required wine. Not just any wine, but wine that met specific standards of purity and production. The cup of wine at the Passover table was not a casual accompaniment. It was a liturgical act, a physical enactment of memory and covenant. 4 cups were prescribed during the Seder, each corresponding to a specific divine promise of redemption. The wine was blessed, it was shared, and it was consumed in a specific order as part of a carefully structured ritual that had been performed for generations. You are seated at a Passover table now in a first-century home in Jerusalem. The room is lit by oil lamps, their small flames casting warm, shifting light across the faces of those reclining around the low table. The reclining posture itself is significant. It is a sign of freedom, borrowed from Greco-Roman dining customs but reinterpreted through Jewish theology. Free people recline at meals, those in bondage do not. You lean on your left elbow, your right hand free to reach for the food and drink spread before you. The table holds unleavened bread, bitter herbs, a paste made from dates and nuts, a roasted bone, an egg, and, at the center of the ritual, wine. The wine has been diluted with water, as is customary. It sits in a communal pitcher, and each person has a cup. Clay for most households, though wealthier families might use glass or even metal. The head of the household lifts his cup and recites the blessing, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of repetition. The words are in Hebrew, even though the everyday language of most Galileans at this time is Aramaic. The blessing sanctifies the wine, transforming it from a simple agricultural product into a vehicle of sacred meaning. When you drink, the wine is warm from the room temperature, slightly sweet, slightly tannic, and you taste the earth of the vineyard where the grapes were grown, the sun that ripened them, the hands that pressed them. This moment, this intersection of the physical and the sacred, the agricultural and the theological, is the heart of what makes the beverage culture of 30 AD so extraordinary. A cup of wine was never just a cup of wine. It was a link in a chain that stretched back through generations of ritual practice, a physical manifestation of a people's relationship with their history, their land, and their understanding of the divine. Take a moment and hit the like button if this perspective has shifted even slightly the way you think about ancient daily life, because these details deserve to be seen by more people, and your like helps make that happen. Let us shift our gaze now from the intimate setting of a household meal to the bustling, chaotic world of the marketplace. You are in Jerusalem, in the lower city, near the pool of Siloam. The streets are narrow, lined with workshops and stalls. The noise is constant, the clang of metal workers, the shouts of vendors, the braying of donkeys loaded with goods. The smell is a dense mixture of spices, animal dung, cooking food, and human sweat. Thousands of people pass through these streets daily, and many of them are thirsty. Street vendors sell drinks. This is not a modern invention. The ancient marketplace had its own version of the beverage stand, and the drinks on offer reflected the full range of what was available. Water, of course, drawn from public cisterns or carried from nearby springs, sold by the cup from large jars. Wine, diluted to varying degrees depending on the price and the customer's preference. Pasca for those who could not afford wine. Fruit juices when the season was right. And herbal infusions, drinks made by steeping various plants, roots, and seeds in hot or cold water. These herbal beverages deserve special attention because they represent a category of drink that is almost invisible in most popular accounts of ancient life. The Eastern Mediterranean was home to an enormous variety of aromatic and medicinal plants: mint, thyme, oregano, anise, cumin, coriander, hyssop, chamomile, fennel. These and many others grew wild or were cultivated in household gardens. Steeping them in water, hot water in cooler months, cold water in summer, produced drinks that were consumed for pleasure, for their perceived health benefits, or simply for variety. A cup of mint-steeped water on a hot day in Jerusalem was not fundamentally different in purpose from a modern glass of iced tea. It was refreshing, mildly flavored, and comforting. The medical tradition of the time took these herbal beverages very seriously. Physicians and healers prescribed specific plant infusions for specific ailments: chamomile for calming the nerves, fennel for digestive discomfort, hyssop for respiratory problems, anise for freshening the breath and settling the stomach. These prescriptions were not based on scientific clinical trials, obviously, but they drew on centuries of accumulated observational knowledge, and many of them have been validated to some degree by modern research. The line between beverage and medicine was blurred in the ancient world, or rather, the distinction barely existed. What you drank was inseparable from how you felt, and choosing the right drink for the right moment was a form of self-care that was practiced at every level of society. There is another beverage category we must explore, and it takes us slightly outside the borders of first-century Palestine into the broader Roman world that surrounded and influenced it: beer. The brewing of beer, the fermentation of grain, primarily barley, was one of the oldest beverage technologies in human history, originating in Mesopotamia and Egypt, thousands of years before the period we are examining. In Egypt, beer was the primary everyday drink, consumed by workers, farmers, priests, and pharaohs alike. It was thick, nutritious, sometimes flavored with dates or honey, and it served as both food and drink. By 30 AD, and beer was still widely consumed in Egypt and in other parts of the Roman Empire, where grain was more readily available than grapes. Roman soldiers stationed in northern provinces, Britain, Gaul, Germania, drank beer when wine was scarce or too expensive to import. But in the eastern Mediterranean heartland, in Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, and Italy, wine was king, and beer was generally regarded as a lower-class foreign drink. The Greek and Roman cultural elite looked down on beer as the beverage of barbarians, a prejudice that tells us more about cultural snobbery than about the quality of the drink itself. Nevertheless, it is likely that some beer was consumed in first-century Palestine, particularly in areas with strong Egyptian or Mesopotamian cultural influence, or among Roman soldiers who had developed a taste for it during service in northern provinces. The beer of this period was not the clear, carbonated, hop-flavored liquid we know today. Hops were not used in brewing until the medieval period. Ancient beer was thick, often cloudy, sometimes consumed through straws to filter out solid grain residue, and flavored with whatever local ingredients were available: dates, honey, herbs, spices. It was more akin to a thin, alcoholic porridge than to a modern lager, and its flavor profile would be almost unrecognizable to a contemporary beer drinker. Share this documentary with someone who loves history, someone who appreciates the details that most people overlook. Because understanding what people drank 2,000 years ago is understanding what it meant to be human in a world so different from ours that it sometimes feels like another planet, yet so similar in its basic needs and desires that the distance collapses when you look closely enough. Now let us enter a space that few documentaries about the ancient world explore in detail: the Roman banquet. This is relevant to our story because the Roman Empire's cultural influence penetrated every corner of its provinces, including Palestine. The wealthy classes in Jerusalem, Caesarea, Sepphoris, and Tiberias were deeply influenced by Roman customs, and the Roman banquet, the convivium, was one of the most elaborate social institutions of the ancient world. You are reclining in the triclinium, the formal dining room, of a wealthy household in Caesarea Maritima, the Roman administrative capital of the province of Judea. The room is decorated with painted plaster walls depicting scenes of abundance: grapevines, fruit bowls, birds, and marine creatures. The floor is mosaic, tiny colored stones arranged in geometric patterns. 3 broad couches are arranged in a U-shape around a central table, and on each couch 3 guests recline, propped on their left elbows, their bodies angled toward the table. The total gathering is 9 people, the ideal number for a Roman dinner party according to the etiquette manuals of the period. The meal has not yet begun, but the drinks are already flowing. A slave. And we must acknowledge that the labor system of the Roman world relied heavily on enslaved people, a reality that pervades every aspect of daily life, including the production and service of food and drink, approaches with a tray of cups. The cups are glass, a relatively new luxury material that has become fashionable throughout the empire. Roman glass cups were often delicate, translucent, and tinted with subtle colors: pale green, blue, amber. They were a status symbol, a way for the host to display wealth and taste. The wine being served is a prized vintage from Italy, possibly from the region of Campania, which was famous for its wines. It has been transported in sealed ceramic amphorae across the Mediterranean by ship, a journey of several weeks, and its arrival at this table in Caesarea represents a vast network of trade, labor, and logistics. The host makes a show of the wine's origin, commenting on its year and its reputation. This is not idle chatter. It is a performance of social capital. Knowing about wine, being able to identify and discuss specific vintages, was a mark of education and refinement in Roman society, much as it is in certain circles today. The wine is mixed with water in a large vessel called a crater, a tradition inherited from the Greeks. The ratio is decided by the host or by a designated symposiarch, a master of drinking, whose job was to set the pace and proportion of the evening's consumption. The goal was to achieve a state of pleasant relaxation without descending into disorder. At least, that was the ideal. In practice, Roman banquets could last for hours, and the drinking could become excessive, a fact that moralists and satirists of the period never tired of criticizing. But the wine at a Roman banquet was not merely mixed with water. It was often flavored, enhanced, and transformed through a variety of additives that would seem bizarre to modern palates. The Romans were enthusiastic experimenters with their wine, adding honey to sweeten it, herbs and spices to flavor it, and, most controversially to modern sensibilities, lead-based compounds to preserve it and give it a sweet, smooth character. A sweetening agent called defrutum was made by boiling grape juice in lead-lined pots, which leached lead into the liquid and gave it an intensely sweet flavor. This practice, which was widespread among the Roman elite, had devastating health consequences that the Romans could not have fully understood. Lead is a cumulative toxin, and chronic exposure causes neurological damage, organ failure, and a range of symptoms that historians have suggested may have contributed to the decline of Roman leadership and decision-making over the centuries. We will not dwell on the toxic aspect. It is a reminder that not every ancient practice was wise. But it is worth noting that the desire to sweeten and improve wine was universal. Honey was the most common additive. Wine sweetened with honey was called mulsum, and it was served as an aperitif at the beginning of a meal, its sweetness thought to stimulate the appetite. Mulsum was offered to guests as a gesture of welcome, and refusing it was considered impolite. The honey used was local, and its flavor varied by region. Wildflower honey from the hillsides of Judea had a different character than the thyme-infused honey of Greece or the citrus-tinged honey of coastal Spain. Spiced wines were another popular category. The Romans added a dizzying array of ingredients to their wine: pepper, cinnamon, saffron, myrrh, nard, anise, coriander, rose petals, and many others. One of the most famous spiced wine recipes from antiquity comes from a Roman cookbook attributed to a figure named Apicius, which details a beverage called conditum paradoxum, a wine infused with honey, pepper, laurel, saffron, and date pits, among other ingredients. The result was a complex, aromatic, almost perfume-like drink that bore little resemblance to what we think of as wine today. It was more akin to a spiced cocktail, layered with flavors that played off each other in ways that were clearly intentional and highly valued. Now let us return to the common people, because the Roman banquet, while fascinating, was the experience of a tiny minority. For the vast majority of the population in 30 AD, the farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, herders, and laborers who made up the backbone of society, the beverage experience was far simpler, but no less essential. A typical day for a working family in first-century Galilee began before dawn. The head of the household, whether farmer, fisherman, or artisan, rose in the dim, pre-dawn light and ate a simple breakfast. Bread, perhaps with olive oil, a few olives, and a cup of diluted wine or water. Breakfast was not a significant meal in the ancient world. It was functional, enough to provide energy for the morning's work. The wine consumed at this hour was the most basic quality available: thin, sharp, heavily diluted, and valued more for its safety and its mild caloric contribution than for any gustatory pleasure. The midday meal was similarly modest. Workers in the fields or on the lake brought their food and drink with them. A leather flask of diluted wine or pasca, a chunk of bread, some dried figs or dates. This was the standard portable meal. The flask was essential. Dehydration in the Mediterranean sun could be rapid and dangerous, and a steady intake of liquid throughout the day was a matter of survival, not comfort. The diluted wine in a worker's flask was warm from the sun, slightly sour, and thin to the point where its alcohol content was minimal. Its purpose was hydration, not intoxication. The evening meal was the main event of the day, the meal around which family life revolved. This was when the household gathered, when bread was broken with deliberation, when prayers were offered, and when the day's best food and drink were consumed. The evening wine might be slightly less diluted, slightly better quality. In prosperous households, the evening meal might include fermented milk, fruit juice, or even a special preparation of honey water seasoned with herbs. The table was low, and the family sat or reclined around it on mats or cushions. The light came from a single oil lamp, its flame small but steady, casting warm shadows across the room. The conversation was quiet. The day's events, the state of the harvest, news from neighboring villages, stories passed down from elders. It is in these quiet moments that the beverages of 30 AD reveal their deepest significance. A cup of wine at the evening meal was not just a drink. It was a moment of community, a ritual of family, a daily anchor in a life that was often precarious. The harvest could fail, disease could strike, Roman taxation could push a family to the edge of survival, political instability could erupt into conflict with terrifying speed. Against all of these uncertainties, the simple act of sharing a cup around a table, the familiar taste, the familiar faces, the familiar words of blessing, provided a stability that transcended the material. It was psychological sustenance as much as physical. a reminder that you belonged somewhere, that you were not alone, that the rhythms of life continued, even when the world outside felt dangerous and unpredictable. And this brings us to what may be the most profound dimension of the beverage culture of 30 AD, its spiritual and symbolic weight. We have already discussed the ritual use of wine in Jewish religious life, the Sabbath, the Passover, the ceremonial occasions where wine was blessed and shared as an act of sacred remembrance. But the symbolism of beverages in this period extended far beyond formal ritual. Water, in the religious imagination of first-century Palestine, was a symbol of life itself. In a semi-arid landscape where drought was a constant threat, water represented divine provision, sustenance, and renewal. The imagery of flowing water, streams, springs, rivers, appeared throughout the scriptures as a metaphor for spiritual abundance. A spring of living water was the most potent symbol of divine blessing, a source that never ran dry, that flowed ceaselessly and freely. In a world where cisterns cracked, wells dried up, and rainwater was unreliable, the idea of a water source that could never be exhausted carried an emotional power that is difficult for people in water-rich societies to fully appreciate. Wine, too, carried a dual symbolism. On one hand, it represented joy, celebration, and abundance. The image of wine flowing freely was a sign of divine favor. A land blessed by its creator would produce wine in abundance. On the other hand, wine could symbolize judgment and suffering when associated with images of treading the winepress, where the crushing of grapes became a metaphor for the trials endured by a people under pressure. This dual nature, joy and sorrow, celebration and sacrifice, made wine an extraordinarily rich symbolic vehicle, capable of carrying complex theological meanings within a single cup. Milk and honey, the twin symbols of the Promised Land, represented fertility, sweetness, and the fulfillment of divine promises. To live in a land flowing with milk and honey was to live in a place where the earth itself provided, where flocks were healthy and bees were productive, where the basic needs of life were met with generous sufficiency. These were not abstract concepts for the people of 30 AD. They were concrete, tangible realities. The goat's milk in the morning, the honey stirred into water, the date syrup drizzled over bread, that connected daily experience to a larger narrative of faith and identity. Let us now consider a moment that has echoed through 20 centuries of human culture. A final meal shared among a small group of people in an upper room in Jerusalem during the Passover festival in or around the year 30 of the Common Era. We do not need to attach specific religious conclusions to this event to recognize its cultural enormity. What we can do is examine what was almost certainly on the table. The meal followed the structure of the Passover Seder, which means that wine was present, not as an optional accompaniment, but as a required, ritually prescribed element. 4 cups of wine, as we discussed earlier, each consumed at a specific point in the ceremony. The wine was diluted with water, as was customary. It was red, most likely, drawn from the abundant vineyards of the Judean hills. The bread was unleavened, flat, crisp, and unfermented, in commemoration of the hurried departure from Egypt described in the ancient texts. Bitter herbs were present, likely horseradish or a similar pungent plant, dipped in salt water to recall the bitterness of past hardships. A paste called charosé, made from dates, nuts, apples, and spices, represented the materials used in forced labor. And the cup, that final cup, the 3rd or 4th of the evening, was lifted, blessed, and shared with words that would be repeated billions of times in the centuries to come. Whatever theological interpretation one places on this moment, the material reality is clear. A cup of diluted red wine, produced from grapes grown on a hillside within a day's walk of this room, pressed by human feet, fermented in clay jars, carried to market on the back of a donkey, purchased for a few small coins, and poured into a common cup. The most exalted spiritual moment in the history of a major world religion rested physically on the shoulders of the most ordinary of beverages. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth that the beverage culture of 30 AD reveals. The sacred was not separate from the everyday. The divine was not housed exclusively in temples and ceremonies. It lived in the cup you drank from at dinner, in the water you drew from the well, in the wine you pressed from your own grapes. The physical and the spiritual were intertwined in a way that modern Western culture, with its sharp separation between the sacred and the secular, often struggles to understand. For the people of the first century, every meal was potentially a sacred act, and every cup was potentially a vessel of meaning. Let us take one more journey before we conclude. Let us step outside the world of Palestine entirely and look at the broader beverage landscape of the Roman Empire in 30 AD. Because the drinks consumed in this single province were just one thread in a vast tapestry. In Rome itself, the capital of the empire, the beverage culture was extravagant and diverse. Wine dominated, of course, but the sheer variety was staggering. Italian wines were graded by region, by vintage, by method of production. The most famous, Falernian, Cacuban, Massic, commanded prices that only the wealthy could afford. Imported wines from Greece, Spain, Gaul, and North Africa filled the warehouses along the Tiber. The Roman appetite for wine was enormous. It has been estimated that the average adult male Roman consumed between half a liter and a full liter of wine per day, though this was heavily diluted with water. In Egypt, beer continued to reign alongside wine. Egyptian beer, called zythos by the Greeks, was a thick, nutritious beverage brewed from barley and sometimes emmer wheat. It was sweetened with dates or honey and flavored with various local ingredients. The brewing tradition in Egypt was millennia old and showed no signs of diminishing under Roman rule. In fact, the Romans were pragmatic enough to appreciate local beverages when they encountered them, even if they privately considered them inferior to wine. Roman officials stationed in Egypt certainly drank beer, and some developed a genuine taste for it. In the eastern provinces, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, a wider range of beverages existed that blended local traditions with Greek and Roman influences. Date wine, made by fermenting date juice, was common in areas where date palms flourished. Palm wine, tapped directly from the trunks of palm trees, was consumed in some regions. Rose water, produced by distilling or steeping rose petals, was used as both a flavoring and a standalone drink in Persian-influenced areas, adding a delicate floral note to the beverage repertoire. In the far north of the empire, Britain, Germania, Gaul, beer and mead were the dominant alcoholic beverages, with wine an imported luxury that only gradually became more available as Roman trade networks expanded. The Celts and Germanic peoples had their own sophisticated brewing traditions, producing ales flavored with herbs like meadowsweet, yarrow, and juniper. These herbal beers, sometimes called gruit, were complex and flavorful, and they represented a parallel beverage technology that developed independently from the wine culture of the Mediterranean. What all of these diverse traditions had in common was a fundamental relationship between beverages and survival. In every corner of the ancient world, what you drank was determined by what your environment could produce, what your technology could transform, and what your culture deemed acceptable. There was no global supply chain, no international food distribution network. You drank what grew near you, what your animals provided, what your local water sources could offer. And within those constraints, human ingenuity produced an astonishing diversity of beverages, each one a response to specific environmental challenges, each one carrying its own web of cultural associations and meanings. As we return now to the starting point of our journey, to that dry, warm morning in Galilee, to the woman carrying her clay jar to the village well, let us reflect on what we have discovered. The world of 30 AD was a world without soft drinks, without coffee, without tea as we know it, without any of the industrially produced beverages that dominate modern life. Yet it was not a world of deprivation. It was a world of remarkable resourcefulness and deep appreciation for what the earth provided. Water was drawn from the ground with effort and treated with respect. Wine was the great universal solvent of social and spiritual life, a daily necessity that connected the drinker to the land, to the community, and to the divine. Fermented milk sustained families through the hot months with its tangy, nourishing substance. Honey water sweetened the lives of those who could access it, carrying the fragrance of wildflowers and the labor of bees. Fruit juices, pomegranate, date, fig, provided bursts of concentrated flavor and energy. Herbal infusions offered comfort, healing, and variety. Pascha kept soldiers marching. Beer, in the regions where it thrived, provided sustenance and social cohesion in its own distinct tradition. Each of these beverages was more than a liquid. Each was a technology, a cultural practice, a social marker, a spiritual symbol, and a sensory experience. Together, they formed a beverage landscape that was as rich and complex as any in human history, not despite the absence of modern technology, but in some ways because of it. Without the homogenizing force of industrial production, every drink was local, every flavor was specific, every cup was connected to a particular place, a particular season, a particular set of hands that had done the work of growing, harvesting, pressing, fermenting, or collecting. And here, at the end of this journey, we arrive at a question that is no longer about the past, but about the present. What has been lost? When you open a can of mass-produced soda, what connection do you have to the ingredients inside? When you drink water from a plastic bottle, do you know where it came from, what aquifer it was drawn from, whose land it flowed through? The people of 30 AD knew exactly where their drinks came from. They had walked to the source. They had pressed the grapes with their own feet. They had milked the goats with their own hands. They had watched the bees enter and leave the hive and had harvested the honey with smoke and careful fingers. Their relationship with what they drank was intimate, direct, and profoundly grounded in physical reality. This is not a call to romanticize the past. Life in 30 AD was hard, often brutally so. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy was short. The absence of clean water technology meant that waterborne diseases were common and frequently fatal. The lack of refrigeration meant constant vigilance against spoilage. The dependence on local production meant that a single bad harvest could bring a community to the edge of starvation. There is nothing romantic about suffering, and the modern world's advances in food safety, water treatment, and distribution have saved countless lives. But there is something worth recovering in the ancient world's approach to beverages, a sense of reverence for the ordinary, an understanding that the simple act of drinking is not trivial, but fundamental. In a world that has largely lost its connection to the sources of its sustenance, the beverages of 30 AD remind us that every cup has a story, every drink has a history, and every sip connects us, if we pay attention, to the vast human project of surviving, creating, and making meaning in a world that has never been easy to inhabit. 30 years into the Common Era, in a small province on the eastern edge of a vast empire, people drank from clay cups filled with wine that tasted like the hillside where the grapes were grown. They drank water that tasted like the stone it had filtered through. They drank milk that tasted like the wild herbs their goats had grazed on that morning. They drank honey water that tasted like the flowers that bloomed within sight of their homes. And in every cup, whether they knew it or not, they drank the full depth of human experience, the labor, the hope, the fear, the faith, the community, and the quiet persistence that has carried our species through every century, every crisis, every sunrise. The next time you lift a glass to your lips, weigh whatever it contains, remember that you are participating in one of the oldest and most universal human rituals. You are doing what people in Galilee did 2,000 years ago, what people in Egypt did 5,000 years ago, what people at the very dawn of civilization did when they first cupped their hands and brought water to their mouths from a running stream. The technology has changed, the flavors have multiplied, the distances have collapsed, but the fundamental act, the meeting of liquid and thirst, the moment of sustenance and relief, remains the same. And in that continuity, across all the centuries and all the miles, there is something that deserves not just understanding but gratitude. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal. If this journey through the beverages of the ancient world has opened your eyes to something you had never considered, then you owe it to yourself to stay with us for what comes next. Because every documentary on this channel is built to transform the way you see the world, one overlooked detail at a time. Se você assistiu até aqui é porque gostou desse caso. Deixe um comentário dizendo, eu assisti até aqui, para que eu possa te conhecer e saber quem realmente gosta das histórias aqui do canal. Hit the like button one final time. Not because we ask, but because this story deserves to reach every curious mind out there. And share this with someone who you know will appreciate a documentary that turns something as simple as a cup of water into a window on an entire civilization. Because that is what history does when you tell it right. It makes the invisible visible, the forgotten unforgettable, and the ordinary extraordinary. 30 AD. No soft drinks, no filtered water, No espresso machines, no smoothie bars, just clay cups, stone wells, sun-warmed wine, and the unbroken human need to drink, to gather, to share, and to endure. That was the world, and now you have tasted it.